I'm chairwoman of the Serbian Council of Great Britain, and it's my privilege to chair this event and to welcome you to the 9th annual memorial service for women in the foreign medical missions in Serbia and related fronts during the Great War. And it's been organised by Zvezdana Popovic, and it's supported by the Serbian Council, the Serbian Society, the St. Sava Serbian Orthodox Church, and members of the Circle of Serbian Sisters Kosovo Maiden. And I think that list of people shows you how important these women are to the Serbian community in Britain. And I'd also like to say thank you to the Embassy for being present here today. The event is one of the many events of Serbian Month, which is now in its 15th year, and which is recognised as being one of the most significant festivals of Serbian arts and culture in the Serbian diaspora. And I look forward to welcoming you to other events. For those of you that have the time, there's a meeting after this called Meet the Doctors, so if you've got any medical issues that you want explored, Jika Petrovic and his colleagues can advise you on that. I'd like to extend a particularly warm welcome to our British friends, Sarah Patterson from the Imperial War Museum, Alan Wakefield and his colleagues from the Salonika Campaign Committee, and Laurie and her friends from the charity A Statue for Elsie Inglis, which is, and because there's the hope of raising a statue to Elsie, that's why we've dedicated this 9th event in her memory. You'll hear about the statue from Fiona at the end of the meeting. The main speaker is Colonel Nick Illich, and having heard him give a talk just recently, I know it's going to be an excellent presentation. But first of all, I'd like to hand over to Zvezdana, who's going to give us a short introduction.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so very pleased and happy and honored to see you all here. I don't have a very strong voice, and I hope that you will hear me at the end of this little room, but if not, come closer or just wave and I'll repeat. This is our 9th annual commemoration. These women, not only from one organization, not from Scotland hospitals, but from many different organizations, came during the Great War to Serbia and to the fronts around. So to Salonika Front, they were at Vido, at Corfu, they were at, there were hospitals also in Malta and Corsica. So these women sacrificed their lives, and they committed themselves to help the Serbs. So it is not only for Dr. Elsie Inglis that we are doing this commemoration. There were many of them, 22 or more, who died are still buried in Serbia or on Thessaloniki Zejtinlik cemetery. And they willingly sacrificed their lives for that small nation and also for themselves, because they wanted to prove that women can do the same things as men can do, and they proved it. So because of the hope of raising the statue, we are talking mainly about Dr. Elsie Inglis. She is my favorite heroine, although there are so many of them that I really like. So can we just, so on this slide here at the top, you can see the plaque from the St. Giles Cathedral. So she didn't get that plaque, her name over there, because she was one of the first women doctors. Yes, she was, but that's not the main thing. She founded these Scottish women hospitals, which were renamed Scottish hospitals for foreign services. and they were sent there where they were needed the most. The most hospitals were in Serbia. In the middle is the bust that Serbian people donated in 1918 to Scottish people. The bust is in National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, and that's the donation box over there, which you can see in Imperial Museum if you go and see the exhibition about the Great War. Can we have the second slide, please? Yes, this is the main information about who she was, who was Dr. Inglis. People ask me, why didn't I put, when I had last talk in my library, why didn't I say more about her background? But this is the crucial point, and I'm just focusing on this point, not on everything else in her life. Next, please. Okay, so just few information. I don't want to spoil Nick's presentation because you will get it all in much better presented way, you will see. I'm exaggerating. This is just first crucial points that people don't know and should know about her. So she is one of the first Scottish doctors. She established maternity hospital in Edinburgh, staffed entirely by women. An active suffragist, please, she was not a suffragette, she was suffragist. It doesn't mean that those who were not suffragettes, they didn't fight for suffrage and to right for women to vote. Yes, they all fight for that. Just they didn't throw stones and smash the windows or burn the telephone boxes or churches. So she was a suffragist, and later we'll hear the text about what was said about her when she died in common cause. This is the text here. So what she said, nevertheless, she did not agree with the suffragettes' methods that women should throw tantrums to show how they deserve right to vote. I repeat that quote every time. I'm sorry if somebody listened a few times and now they're maybe annoying them, but that's true. You can show what you can do, and that would be your power, not by being rude or throwing stone or something else at somebody else. That was from the book from Margoret's Shadow of Swords. She was brave, determined, and full of energy, but she was also ill, and she died in line of duty. She was founder of Scottish hospitals in 1914, and just my comment at the end, why, as Olga said, we are talking today mostly about her because there is a really, really strong chance that she will have her statue in Royal Mile in Edinburgh soon. Not this year, maybe next year, but she will have. And I'm certain that her spirit will help us all to achieve that goal. So let's just see in the common cause what it says about. I will give you pictures. So this is common cause. It says the common cause of humanity, Dr. Elsie Inglis, from 30th November 1917. Most of the documents, and I have here only 4 panels, are actually from documents that I collected from Women's Library in Elsie. If you have time and permission, go and check for yourself. There are boxes of thousands and thousands of documents that people don't know that they exist. And they don't teach it in schools, they don't teach, even if you do history, you will skip everything what is not related basically to Western Front. So Salonika Front is quite neglected. And I hope that we are doing a little bit to change that knowledge and attitude. So it says here, this is the organ of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And this was one of the branches of the society. And it was Friday, November 13, 1917. It says law-abiding. That's very, very, very important. So they are not supporting not law-abiding activities. And it says, Dr. Elsie Inglis, we go to the press this week under the shadow of a great grief. Dr. Elsie Inglis had just returned from Russia with the London units of Scottish hospitals. So all this information can sound really strange and new if you did not have chance to read more about her. But I don't want to spoil this beautiful text, and I would like to ask Olga if you can read. So the first paragraph, and then from here to the rest.
I hope I do it justice. We go to press this week under the shadow of a great grief. Dr. Elsie Inglis, who has just returned from Russia with the London units of the Scottish Women's Hospitals, died on the evening of November the 26th. It is one of those losses that cannot be measured in words. A loss not to Dr. Inglis's friends and colleagues alone, but to our country and to the women's movement. In 1915, Dr. Inglis went out herself to Serbia to cope with the typhus epidemic. She remained in Serbia during the German invasion, staying with her Serbian wounded till the last. She was taken prisoner by the Germans, handed over to the Austrians, and finally released. She returned to England, but only to prepare for fresh efforts. Again, she pressed the War Office to accept the women's hospitals for service with the British troops in the East. They were once more refused. Then an opportunity offered for helping Serbia again, and Dr. Inglis, who had become deeply attached to the Serbian people in the time of their misfortunes, was eager to take it. She went out again in August 1917 with the London units of the Scottish Women's Hospitals, units which were part of the war work of the London Society of Women's Suffrage, to serve with the Serbian division of the Russian army on the Russo-Romanian front. During the last few months, the units have been working in southern Russia, and it was there that Dr. Inglis fell ill. She returned to England at the last week, remaining in command of her unit until it were all safely landed, and died at a British port on Monday evening. Those who have known Dr. Inglis since the war will think of her as the founder and moving spirit of the National Union of Women Suffrage Society's Scottish Women's Hospitals, whose good work is now known in all the Allied countries. Her Serbian friends, of whom she had many, will think of her as the devoted lover of Serbia, the country in whose service she died, and for whom we cannot doubt that she was glad to give her life. Members of the NUWSS will think of her first and foremost as a great suffragist. Before the war, said Dr. Inglis, not long ago, I had only two thoughts, suffrage and surgery, and now I feel that I'm working for suffrage still. When we come back, women will have votes, she said joyfully as she left the wharf with her units on her last enterprise. She was always a suffragist, and her work for the Women's Hospital was part of her suffrage work. She wanted women to take their full part and share in the service of their country and the cause of freedom. Her services and the services of the hospitals she inspired were offered first and foremost to her own country, and then when the offer was not accepted by our government, she worked for the Allied cause and the sufferers of the war wherever the need was sorest. A Serbian officer once said to her, Some of us are more grateful to you for coming here and showing what women can do than even for the practical help. I think something we could still learn from that. She used to repeat the words with pride. She is an inestimable loss to our cause, but she died for freedom and for those who have suffered most bitterly in the war, and our sorrow is mingled with pride.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, can you have the next slide, please? Yes, this is what, just one quote from that, and one of the most important quotes. And what she said at the end here, you see, when she was planning that specialty hospitals, that was her idea. And said, you see, we get these expert women doctors, nurses, and the ambulance workers organized. We send our units wherever they are wanted. Once these units are out, the work is bound to grow. The need is there, and too terrible to allow any haggling about who does the work. From the very beginning, we must make it clear that our hospitals are as well equipped and well manned as any in the field, more economical, easy, and thoroughly efficient. I cannot think of anything more calculated to bring home to men the fact that women can help intelligently in any kind of work. So much of our work is done where they cannot see it. They will see every bit of it. Can you have next slide, please? This is the last mission that was mentioned in this course. So that Russian unit had 76 women, doctors, radiologists, pharmacists, 17 nurses, 16 orderlies, domestic staff, and also 50 tons of equipment. So this is what they planned. And this was a bill for funds. And it says, at the request of the Serbian government, the London committees are providing. So what are they providing? They're providing 2 new field hospitals and a motor transport section. So they were really, really fantastically organized and committed to the work and to help. And the London committee would be placed in Victoria Street, very, very close to today's Westminster Town Hall. There is no building at the moment, it's just alley. So it would be in the center, and they were really engaged with everything. Do we have more? Yes, and also there will be more comments about that. So the legacy is not only in our remembrance, but also in real work that they did, and the hospital that was established in her name in Belgrade. The hospital exists. These are the panels I took photographs a few years ago when I did this research. And so this is just the first one with chief founders. And it says, the London and Edinburgh Memorial Committees of Scottish Women Hospitals. Then you have Mr. George Wyford, Belgrade, and then you have King and Queen on the other panels. So on these few other, you will see, if you have time to watch it later, just few names, a few pictures of other women who died and who are buried in Serbia. But I would not take more of your time. I'm really, really happy that you are here, and let's give the microphone to Nick. Thank you very much, Nick.
From my perspective, I would first of all like to pay tribute to Zvezda, who really has kept the flame alive of what these women did in the Great War. I was for the last 3 years defence attaché in Belgrade. I'm delighted that Colonel Draga Dabovic is here, who's a Serbian de facto defence attaché here in London. And one of the great bits of my job was to go quite regularly around Serbia, laying wreaths to the graves of amazing women with amazing stories. Graves that are immaculately kept by the villagers where they're buried, or in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Niš. and they haven't been forgotten in Serbia. And it's really quite sad that the Salonika Front, the story of all these female medical missions that went to Serbia during the Great War, have been forgotten, very much so here in the United Kingdom. And all the talk tends to be about the Western Front. But the Salonika Front and the sacrifice of these women provide a huge, vast role model for women today, in terms of they demonstrated that actually, women can do anything. And it's quite an amazing story, and regrettably we haven't got time today to cover the whole story. So rather than focus on all the missions, as Vesna said, today we're going to basically pay tribute to Elsie Inglis and the Scottish Women's Hospital to give you an idea of why they went, where they went, and what they did, and what conditions they actually worked under in that respect. In terms of background, from a diplomatic perspective, the area for many centuries was occupied by the Ottomans, and really our relations with Serbia began in 1837, just at the time when Queen Victoria was coming onto the throne. But it was really during the Great War that British and Serbian relations were at the high point. And the current foreign minister of Serbia, Ivica Dačić, said, I hope that at some stage in the future our relations return to the same as that in the Great War. And like Vesna said, there were many medical missions that deployed. Serbian Relief Fund, the British Serbian Red Cross, but the most famous of all these was the Scottish Women's Hospital for Foreign Service. Not solely recruited in Scotland, but also recruited around the United Kingdom, but basically the figurehead was Elsie Inglis. And in terms of the story itself of the Great War, we have to go back slightly earlier to understand why they were so desperate and needed at that stage. And that's why we go back to 1912, 1913, at the time of the First and Second Balkan Wars. Because, of course, this was the point where the Balkan nations finally ejected the Ottoman Empire from the final bits of territory that they still controlled in present-day Serbia and everywhere else. But the point was, at the end of these wars, Serbia was very much on its knees. 2 years of fighting, very proud, morale was high, having been victorious, but very much on its knees. And of course, Austria-Hungary feared a unification in many respects of the Serb peoples in what we used to know as Yugoslavia in that respect, and therefore wanted to deal with what they referred to as the Serbian question. And of course, with Serbia on its knees, they now had an opportunity in many requests, and all they needed was support from Germany. But the first medical missions that were established at this time were established by this amazing woman here, Lady Leila Paget. In fact, she was a great benefactor to the church, the church hall here. She was the wife of Ralph Paget, who was the ambassador in Belgrade, and her medals are here behind me. The highest orders of the Serbian White Eagle on the right, and also then the Order of St. Sava on the left. An amazing woman who established the first military hospital in Belgrade. And at the end of the day, that's when our support basically started. The July crisis of 1914, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was an excuse to start a war. Austria today admits that no sovereign nation would have ever accepted the ultimatum that Austria made to Serbia as a result of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And of course, Germany wanted to deal with its opponents, particularly France and Russia, and also Britain to a certain extent, and gave Austria-Hungary, as we know, this blank cheque to basically do what they will, we will support you, whatever. But like I said, the Serbian army was exhausted, but being motivated, it was prepared to fight when the invasion finally came. Of course, the first place to be attacked in the Great War was Belgrade from the Danube River Fleet, from across the road from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the problem for Serbia was, like I said, it was exhausted. And you only have to look at the statistics here in terms of how few doctors were available for the Serb military at this time when it was now faced with invasion. Only 534 trained doctors. And whilst the doctors were well trained, the standard of nursing was described, you'll see later, as medieval. It simply wasn't to any extent the same standards that we had at those stages of 1914. And therefore, with the war approaching, the Serbian medical service was never in position to be able to cope with the sheer weight of casualties on its own side, but also probably from the other side in terms of their opponents in that respect. And you can see here the state of a field hospital in terms of makeshift beds made out of bits of wood and all the rest of it, something that we wouldn't have. And certainly the cleanliness wasn't there. And of course, one of the things we majored on in terms of our medical services was the importance of cleanliness, clean running water, so on and so forth itself. So lo and behold, the First World War starts with the invasion, effectively, of Serbia. Now, one of the things that saved Serbia at that time, of course, was the mobilisation by Russia of its army. And therefore, a large element of the Austro-Hungarian force was diverted to basically prevent the Russians coming towards its territory. And therefore, in late August 1914, the Serbs were able to deliver the first Allied victory of the war at the Battle of Ter, where basically, after the Austro-Hungarians had crossed over the Drina River, they were simply thrown back after about a week or 10 days of fighting, once the basic two armies effectively met. But the point is, thousands of Austro-Hungarian prisoners were taken and many, many wounded, which only then made the situation worse for the Serbian medical services in that respect. Having then reconstituted themselves, the Austro-Hungarians tried again. In November 1914, they attacked again, and this time managed to drive the Serbian army back and even captured Belgrade. So Belgrade was now occupied. But at this stage, what the Serbs were doing was manoeuvring. They didn't know where the main thrust was going to come from, and therefore counterattacked at the Battle of Kolubara. And again, managed to not only liberate Belgrade, but again, once again, drive the Austro-Hungarians out of Serbia. But the problem was, this time round, the Austro-Hungarians brought an even worse enemy, typhus. And as you can see there, some 50 or 60,000 prisoners were captured, and many of these had typhus. And of course, typhus now spread across Serbia itself, which caused, as you can imagine, a major nightmare. All three types of typhus were present. I'm not a medical expert, there might be more, but I understand that these are the three types. And you can see in terms of casualties, 35,000 soldiers and 100,000 civilians were to die from typhus. Not fighting, typhus alone. And when you think about the numbers of doctors, as you can see, 132 of the 500 or so doctors also perished. Serbia was about to become extinct unless something was to happen. That's how perilous it basically was, and Serbia was very much on its knees. So a request went out from the Serbian government to all the Allied nations for help. And of course, it's a bit like what's going on in Ukraine now, in terms of, you can imagine the sympathy that the Serbia would have had been attacked from a greater power, and lo and behold, many, many Allied countries sent medical missions. Different sizes, but by far the largest medical support provided to Serbia during the Great War came from Great Britain. And that's again a little known fact in that respect. The first 600-bed hospital was actually English in design, it wasn't Scottish. And I went to a talk in Belgrade to commemorate the anniversary of Serbian nursing. And again, that caused some surprise in terms of, can you imagine the first help came from England? That was all, people were quite shocked because people know about the Scottish, but this was the English. And lo and behold, no surprise, it was Lady Paget. And she established a military hospital in Skopje, which is now in North Macedonia. The Scottish women then sent their first hospital in December of 1914, and you can see how, from that point on, more and more of these medical missions were arriving, mainly equipped by women in that respect. As Zvezdan has basically said, she was part of the suffrage movement, not a suffragette, a suffragist. And of course, their aim was to basically build hospitals manned entirely by women, and would need £1,000 to be raised in order to do this. In fact, during the war, they raised the equivalent of £30 million in today's money for these hospitals. It was a huge fundraising effort in itself. And of course, they went to the War Office and said, we've got these women who are prepared to do their bit for their country, form field hospitals with trained nurses, trained doctors, and the War Office told them to go home and sit still. War was not the place for women. But of course, these were women who knew they wanted to play their part, so lo and behold, they therefore offered their services to the Allied nations. And of course, it was only Britain who didn't use women's hospitals in the same way as our allies did, in the same way as France, Belgium and Serbia did. And there's Elsie basically contemplating what she was going to do. Like I said, the first hospitals went to France and Belgium, and then the first hospital sent to Serbia set sail from Southampton under the command of Dr Eleanor Soltau. Elsie was very much back in the UK, raising money to get more hospitals basically formed. And from there, they moved to Kragujevac, which was one of the worst places to be when it came to typhus. Because all the patients were coming to the military hospitals located in Kragujevac, and all the hospitals there were overflowing in that respect. And of course, as soon as women arrived, they immediately set to work, and the first thing that they did was clean the buildings to make sure that when the patients arrived, they were fit for standards in terms of our medical care, as opposed to the medieval conditions that they basically inherited in that respect. And there's a picture there at the top of Kragujevac at that time, cattle in the streets, as was the norm in that respect. cleanliness was a real big issue. But straight away, these women set to work, and the fact that these women had arrived emboldened the Serbian soldiers and the Serbian people. The fact that these women were prepared to leave, effectively, by their standards, life of luxury and peace in the United Kingdom, to sacrifice almost everything in Serbia, meant a huge amount. And one of the things that the women always talked about was how the Serbian soldiers who were wounded never complained. They never complained because they were embarrassed, because of course they were being looked after by British women, and therefore they will disgrace themselves by complaining. So it's quite an important factor in that respect. Like I said, the patients were wounded, they were sick, and they were also the injured, thousands of them. And like I said, the problem was the nursing was medieval, and of course what these women then demonstrated what was the art of the possible, and that therefore then swept amongst the Serbian nation. And by the end of January of 1915, you can see how typhus was now a real big issue in that respect. Sadly, right from the beginning, women started to die. In fact, the first casualty died on Christmas Day of 1914. And in Kragujevac today, in the centre there, you can see the picture of Dr Elizabeth Ross. She arrived from Persia, where she was almost like a missionary out there. She was from Scotland herself, joined the Scottish Women's Hospitals in that area, although she wasn't a member of the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and sadly she died on the birthday on the 14th of February of 1915. And she's buried alongside Lorna Ferris and Mabel Dearmer. Mabel Dearmer, a very famous writer. Her husband was a British padre and a doctor. And they're buried together, and on the 14th of February every year, there's always a commemoration, and the whole city virtually turns out in Kragujevac to remember their sacrifice. And of course, someone else who died at that time was Louisa Jordan. Again, a nurse from the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and if you remember, during the height of the COVID crisis, was here in London and elsewhere in England, we had the Nightingale hospitals. The COVID hospital in Glasgow was the Louisa Jordan Hospital, named after her in terms of her memory. And she's buried in the military cemetery in Niš in Serbia, along with many other nurses. Another character who came in at this time was Thomas Lipton. I'm sure many of you remember Lipton's tea, you can still get it, but the plight of Serbia also caught his imagination. So he visited Serbia to find out what was going on, and then offered support to the Serbs in terms of his yachts that transported tea around the globe. And therefore many nurses travelled to Serbia from the UK, from Southampton, through the Mediterranean, in order to get to central Serbia on his yachts. And again, he wrote a very famous account of the suffering that Serbs were enduring at that stage. The ongoing plight brought more and more funds in, and unexpectedly for the Scottish Women's Hospitals, they were able to build more and more hospitals as these volunteers came along. Sadly, Dr Saltau became ill, and therefore Elsie Inglis herself deployed via Corsica to Serbia, in addition to Alice Hutchinson, who established another hospital in the town of Valjevo. And there we have them there just before they left. And then a fourth went to Mladenovac, as you can see there, in May 1915, and then a fifth, and Lazarevac, as you can see there, in August of 1915, under Dr Holland. So we had a large number of Scottish women's hospitals there, in addition to everything else that was going around the place. And so the sight of these nurses was an inspiration for the people and for themselves. They demonstrated to themselves what they could do and show the standard to the Serbs in that respect. So that's where the hospitals are located, very much up to the northern parts of Serbia, because of course the threat from Austro-Hungary was very much in that direction there. But the problem was that if they were attacked again, they would all be effectively vulnerable. So lo and behold, they played a significant part in basically ending the typhus epidemic. And like I said, in addition to cleanliness, one of the things which Dr Elsie Inglis was renowned for was basically the provision of clean running water. And therefore in 1915, a memorial fountain in honour of Elsie Inglis and all the Scottish Women's Hospitals was opened in Mladenovac. And again, on the anniversary of the breakout from Salonika, every 15th September, there's a commemoration that takes place in Mladenovac to remember Elsie Inglis there, and that memorial still very much stands, and you'll see it later, very much there. Now, of course, one of the reasons why they were able to not eradicate but reduce the threat from typhus was because they went into what we'd all recognise as lockdowns. They also identified the main cause of typhus being spread, and that was basically the flea. So lo and behold, it was Dr William Hunter, another Scot, but a military surgeon, who came up with the idea of the eradication of fleas in clothing by developing what became known as a Serbian barrel. And the Serbian barrel basically was a method by which, through fire, through steam, you'd basically, disinfect sheets and clothing, and therefore when you put patients on sheets, rather than then obviously then contaminating the beds and everything else, that's how effectively they got rid of fleas and things in hospitals, but also obviously in terms of uniforms. And although it was known as the Serbian barrel, on the top left there, that's an Austro-Hungarian version that they developed as a result of the Serbian version in that respect. So that's basically how typhus was basically brought under control, by strict lockdown, preventing movement and the eradication of typhus through the eradication of fleas in that respect. But the problem was, no sooner had the typhus epidemic been sorted, after a peaceful summer, Austria-Hungary, supported now very much by Germany, and now Bulgaria, who came into the war, attacked Serbia. And so now we have 750,000 enemy troops advancing on a beleaguered Serbian army of some 250 to 300,000 who were deployed into the field itself. And therefore, absolutely surrounded, mainly on all fronts, they had to basically fall back. And very, very quickly, the Austro-Hungarian and Central Powers basically were able to overcome Serbian resistance, and the Serbian army effectively started to redeploy in and around Kosovo, Polja, as you all know in terms of our Serbian history in that respect. So lo and behold, as soon as they basically started to attack, that the hospitals then started to fall back towards Kragujevac. And of course, all the medical supplies had to be packed up in haste and basically saved in that respect. They needed very much further down. The army basically deployed. Here you can see the Scottish Women's Hospitals in their hospitals deploying backwards. And I'll just point out, still very much in their uniforms. It was all about standards, it's all about discipline, it's all about cleanliness. Quite an amazing picture in that respect. Many took the opportunity to get on trains in order to get themselves further south towards Salonika. However, as Vesna said, many also chose to remain with their wounded, because at the end of the day, that's what they were there for in that respect. And therefore, knowing full well what could happen to them, they still chose that course of action. Sadly, for Dr Inglis, she moved to Kruševac, where she was basically captured with her hospitals, and then Dr Hutchinson with her hospital moved to Brniška Banja, and again she too was captured. And again, an amazing picture of some of those nurses, again immaculately dressed, absolutely immaculately dressed, maintaining those standards with their captors from the Austro-Hungarian army, and also some Bulgarians there as well. And I think their expressions on their faces basically say it all in that respect. Very proud women who basically would sacrifice their freedom for the people they were trying to nurse in that respect. Like I said, the Serbian army concentrated in Kosovo, and that's where they had to make a decision what to do. By this stage, the British and the French had sent divisions, in fact the 10th Irish Division, which is another reason why we're very close to the Irish, from the Dardanelles, from the Gallipoli campaign. They arrived at Thessaloniki. They basically moved south to relieve pressure on the Serbs, but sadly there were no match effective for the Bulgarians, who basically drove them back south towards Salonika. And it was news that the Allies could not support them, that the Serbs then decided, rather than surrender, they'd then begin the perilous journey over the mountains of Albania and Montenegro to safety, where they were assured that the Allies would send ships for their salvation in that respect. And lo and behold, women also joined that retreat. And of course, if you are a Serb, the Albanian retreat is something which is a part of our collective history in terms of the horrors of what happened. Tens of thousands of people perished on that retreat. It was not only an army on the move, it was also the entire nation. It was the government, it was the church. 30,000 schoolboys, the elite of the Serbian youth went with them. Only 7,000 survived that perilous journey through the mountains in terms of schoolboys. But tens of thousands died in the snow from exhaustion, and those who fell back were then killed very much by Albanian terrorists, regrettably, who were trying to basically take what they could from the bodies. But the whole army basically moved. They refused to surrender. And amazingly, in the Great War, no single Serbian battle flag was captured by the enemy. And so when news got to Kaiser Wilhelm that the Serbs had been defeated, he asked the question, where are the standards? And of course, no standard was put before him. With no standards captured, the army was therefore still alive in that respect. So the retreat continued. It continued for about 3 or 4 weeks as they went over the mountains. And as you can see on the picture on the right, a very graphical image, it wasn't just soldiers, it was also women who were basically very much part of the battle. The nation was on its move towards salvation. And like I said, part of that was made up from the medical missions from the Scottish Women's Hospitals, from the Stobart Hospital, and so on and so forth. And again, quite graphic images of what it must have been like. And you can just imagine, this is the stuff of Hollywood, and yet it's not known very much in the West in terms of what was done. In terms of the women who were captured, initially they were really well treated by the Germans. But one interesting factor, there's a statue, as you all know, here in London near Trafalgar Square, to Edith Cavell, who was executed by the Germans. And at one point, the German commandant who was looking after Elsie Inglis at her hospital asked Elsie to sign a certificate to basically say that they'd been well treated. And she refused to sign that on the grounds that she didn't want this to be used for propaganda purposes. And after that, basically, they started to have a hard time from the Germans themselves. But eventually, they were repatriated via Hungary to Vienna, and that's a picture of them having been released in Vienna. And they went back to the UK via Geneva, eventually returning to England on the end of February of 1916. Rather than sit still and do nothing, Elsie went back into fundraising to raise more money in terms of getting more support. Meanwhile, the Serbian army, the government, the clergy, what was left of the boys, and the rest of the nation eventually got to the Adriatic. Another 1,000 died in another 2-week perilous journey in order to get to the place where the Italian ships, we always talk about French ships, but in fact Italian ships, basically rescued them and took them to the island of Corfu. That was basically taken by the Allies from the Greeks for the purpose of reconstituting the Serbian army on Corfu itself. And again, those doctors and nurses from Scottish Women's Hospitals and the like accompanied them to Corfu, set up in order to treat them. And of course, thousands more died on Corfu. I think some 11,000 died after they arrived there. So overwhelming the ground, and therefore so many are now buried in what's known as the Blue Graveyard between Corfu itself and the island of Vido. Very much sacred ground in that respect. But France, in order to reconstitute, the Serbs provided, as you can see there, the rifles, the machine guns, the artillery, whilst the British very much provided other aspects like rations, ammunition, vehicles, animals and uniforms. And therefore the Serbian army was re-equipped, and amazingly, despite what had happened to them in terms of the invasion, the perilous retreat over the Albanians and Montenegrin mountains, 6 months later they boarded Allied ships and were then joined by the French and the British at Salonika. And in addition to the military hospitals, volunteer missions would also provide contributions, and therefore the hospitals continue to be sent from the UK itself. And there we have another party of the Scottish Women's Hospitals that have to establish themselves at Salonika in that regard. I mentioned the boys. Like I said, some 30,000 young boys, the elite of the Serbian education system, accompanied that retreat. Only 7,000 sadly survived. Many went to Malta, to Corsica, and also to France, and some 350 came here to the UK. Very famously in Edinburgh, we talked about Elsie Inglis at the Heriot School. And again, here's some pictures of those boys there, not only in terms of pupils, but they were the people who introduced rugby into Serbia. And of course, even in the first 15, in 17 and 18 and 19, you've got Serb boys playing for the Heriot School. And when obviously at the end of the war, they went back to Serbia, and that's why in Serbia there's a thriving rugby league and rugby union heritage in that respect. And one of the great friends of the Serbian people in today's day is a lovely lady called Louise Miller, who wrote a fantastic book about Flora Sands, the only Western woman to fight as a soldier in the Great War. And she goes back to Serbia every year around the 14th of February to be at Kragujevac, and she brings together the heirs and successors of these boys. And again, a story that hasn't been forgotten in that respect. Like I said, many refugees went to many of the islands in the Mediterranean, mainly in Corsica. In fact, one of the hospitals that arrived for service in Serbia when it got to Salonika was then sent back to Corsica to establish a hospital there and remained in support of the Serbian refugees until the spring of 1919. And again, money was then also raised in order to get these boys back into the education system so they wouldn't be lost to future generations of the Serbs. But the majority of the hospitals were then established at Salonika. And this map on the left-hand side just shows how many hospitals were located in support the British, French, Greek, Italian, Russian at one stage, forces there. It was a true coalition operation. And as you can see, two of the hospitals were Scottish Women's Hospitals themselves. Why were there so many hospitals? The fighting in Salonika was very, very different to the fighting on the Western Front. The conditions, the nature of the ground, the mountains, the hard rocks, the massive range in climates from bitterly cold winters to ridiculously hot summers, the fact that malaria was rife meant that actually fighting could only take part at certain times of the year because it was physically impossible to fight at other times. And although I think, Alan, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think Britain suffered some 27,000 dead, the overall number of casualties for the British Army in Salonika was over 450,000 because of illness, disease, and physically being injured because of the nature of the ground itself. So it's a colossal, number of people who need to be looked after. And this is again what the Scottish Women's Hospitals, as well as all the other hospitals, were there to do in terms of support those forces that were there. One of the hospitals that was recruited was made through donations of two women's colleges at Cambridge University, the Newman Girton unit, and that then deployed to Salonika. And at the end of the war, it was that unit that basically established the hospital in Belgrade, in Dedinje, which Zvezdan talked about later. The fundraising went well beyond the United Kingdom. It also went to America, and therefore an American unit, raised through American funds, but mainly manned again by British nurses, again also arrived in Salonika. But as the fighting continued, they therefore, instead of being in and around Salonika, deployed very much closer to the front where they could support the Serbian soldiers, and therefore very much perilously in danger compared with other hospitals elsewhere on the European theatre. As you can see, that hospital then moved to Vranje under the command of Dr Elizabeth Emsley, later Emsley Hutton, and the present-day medical school in Vranje is now named after her as well. Again, very famously remembered in terms of her sacrifices at the time. But like I said, life in Salonika was very difficult because of the nature of the climate, but also, particularly for the young nurses, was brilliant because this was now for them an expression of freedom. In terms of they were no longer constrained by life, let's say, in the UK. And what was really interesting about their time in Salonika was the battles in terms of, the old way of doing things and the fact that these girls wanted to have a bit of fun as well. At the end of the day, dare I say, sexual chemistry is what it is, and therefore many fell in love and all the rest of it. And therefore it was a fascinating time. But above all, what they all did was fall in love with the Serbian people, and the Serbian people fell in love with them. It really was like a marriage in that respect, in the most beautiful way. And of course, when there was lots in the fighting, end of the day they had to live, and that's where they basically explored Serbian culture and life and society itself. Like I said, Elsie Inglis went back to the UK having been released, and immediately, like Zvezdan had described, started to raise money for a Russia unit because the Serbian army provided division to the Russians in the area of Romania and obviously now present-day Ukraine. And so they left for Odessa, the last port the Ukrainians currently hold, in August of 1916. But as soon as they arrived, straight away they realised things weren't going particularly well, because already in Russia there was talk of revolution. And of course 1917 was obviously when that clearly erupted. And therefore no sooner had they effectively arrived, effectively done great things, they suddenly realised that they had to get themselves back, and therefore they embarked on a perilous journey from Odessa through Archangel to try and get back to England. And like Zvezdan described, all this time Elsie was hiding a secret, and that secret was that she had cancer. And therefore no sooner had she basically arrived back in England, in Newcastle, than 2 days later, sadly, 3 days later she died, regrettably, of exhaustion brought about by her suffering. What an amazing woman, what an amazing role model, and what amazing things that they basically did. In terms of her last wish, was very much for the London Committee not to forget her beloved Serbs, to make sure that they got another hospital. And as a result of that, a new unit was formed, named after her, the Elsie Inglis unit, and that was basically made up, like Zvezdan said, of veterans from Russia. And before they actually deployed to Salonika, they actually marched in their smart uniforms to Buckingham Palace, where they were inspected by the King and Queen. Such was their, fame at that stage. And yet, like I said, today you wouldn't think they existed, which is really They then moved in April of 18, with 6 months left of the war to fight, back to Salonika, some 30 miles from Salonika, close up to the front. And then from there, after the breakout on the 15th of September, accompanied the Serbian army to Skopje, and then from Skopje to Sarajevo. and that's where they remained in an old boys' school, boys' drama school. There's 2 schools in Sarajevo, so that's where they were until then. They were then repatriated back to England in April of 1919. Like I said, with the end of the war, there was a question of what to do. And of course, some of the units were still very much in Serbia. Many of the nurses remained behind. Sadly, the likes of Evelina Haverfield set up an orphanage in Bajina Bašta, and she then died in Bajina Bašta in 1921, and she's still buried there in that respect. But it was then decided to establish, with the funds that were still available, a memorial hospital in Belgrade. Typically, it's a very Serbian thing, I suppose. No sooner had the war ended, but then the arguments restarted in terms of what was the right thing to do and everything else. And it was only then in 1929 that the foundation stones were actually laid in Dedinje in Serbia to erect the hospital in the honour of Elsie Inglis. And like I said, it's now within the complex of the Dragiša Mitrović hospital. And sadly, in 1999, during NATO's air campaign, the hospital was badly damaged. 4 people, sadly, were also killed in the hospital, but it's been rebuilt. And thankfully, the memorial stones that Zvezdana has described are still very much in one piece. And you can see there the memorial stones in terms of the inscription, who the main benefactors were, led by the King and the Queen, and obviously many notable individuals, not only from Scotland, the wider UK, but also, as you can see there, the United States of America as well, in honour of the Scottish unit that deployed. But the women really haven't been forgotten. In fact, at the start of the commemorations for the Great War, this series of stamps was brought out as part of the Serbian Post Office series of stamps, where you can see there that the nurses are remembered, not only in terms of Elizabeth Ross, but also Elsie Inglis. But see the top left there, you can see Flora Sands. Of course, Flora Sands deployed to Serbia as a nurse originally. And it was when they were in the area of Kosovo, when the decision was made to evacuate the nursing missions, that she was with the Iron Regiment. She was then given the option of remaining with the unit, but if she remained with the unit, she had to become a soldier. And so lo and behold, she then became the first enlisted woman in any Western army. She won effectively the Serbian version of the Victoria Cross, the Karađorđe star with cross swords, in 1916 when the Bulgarians counterattacked. She then was badly wounded in that, returned to the UK to raise money in order to establish canteens, returned with the Serbian army and continued with the Serbian army in the advance to Belgrade, and became the first woman ever to become an officer in the Serbian army. And she became an officer in the Serbian army because the army petitioned the king that women could be officers, whereas prior to that the constitution didn't allow it. And therefore she remained in Serbia through that time as an officer, became a border guard, and then when the Germans then invaded it in 1941, she put on the uniform again, was captured by the Germans, held under house arrest for the duration of the war, and then sadly when communism took over, she realised, because of the anti-British feeling at that time, she couldn't remain in the beloved Serbia, and then came back to England, and she then died in Suffolk in 1956. Again, another amazing woman, and if you haven't read the story, Fine Brother by Louise Miller, I can firmly recommend you. But the point is, what they did hasn't been forgotten, and certainly won't be forgotten by the Serbian people. And like I said, over 1,000 of these women served in the hospitals across 13 different nations, but by far the greatest sacrifice was made in Serbia. Of the 15 that died, 10 to the Scotch Women's Hospital, 10 died in Serbia, and many are then still buried there, not only in the military cemetery in Niš, but elsewhere in places like Bajina Bašta and elsewhere. The British ambassador's residence in Belgrade, where the ambassador lives, is now known as Elsie Inglis House. And then each year in Mladenovac, like I said, she's remembered, as we do today here in London, at the memorial fountain that still stands in her honour and the honour of the Scottish Women's Hospitals. I'm really delighted that Fiona Garwood's here, who was one of the founding members of the campaign to erect a statue to Elsie in the Royal Mile in Scotland, and this year Fiona's taking a group, if you want to go, let Fiona know, to Serbia in order to visit many of these sites, in order to be there on the 15th of September, but they'll be also going to Niš, to Vranje, to Belgrade, Mladenovac, and therefore do see Fiona after. I don't know, would you want to say anything, Fiona, at this stage? She's got the itineraries, if you're interested, do see it. It'll be a fascinating trip. Anyway, that's all I had to say really. An amazing woman, an amazing group of women, absolute role models for society to this day, and for whatever reason forgotten, and largely forgotten, I think, because of our genuine understanding of the sacrifice that was made on the Western Front. But the Salonika Front and all those who took part in it was very much the forgotten front and very much the forgotten people in that respect. But to use Vesna, once again, thank you for keeping her flame alive. It's something which, history is not something that's in the past, it's something that very much resonates in the present, and we must preserve our historic links between our two nations well into the future. So I'm delighted that you've all been here. Thank you for organising this, and thank you not only to the Serbian community who's turned out today, but also to Alan, to the rest of the Salonika Campaign Society for taking part, and hopefully you've found that interesting. You might have hopefully learned something, and if there are any questions, by all means use the opportunity and we'll try and answer them. If I can't answer them,